different time zones, different countries. Have somebody watch this video. ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ। ਤੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਬੁੱਕ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਚੈਪਟਰ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਣ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਹੈ ਨਾ। ਕੈਨ ਤੋਂ ਟਾਈਟਲ ਹੈ ਕੈਨ ਅ ਕੰਪਿਊਟਰ ਹੈਵ ਅ ਮਾਈਂਡ। Introduction. Over the past few decades, electronic computer technology has made enormous strides. Moreover, there can be little doubt that in the decades to follow, there will be further great advances in speed, capacity, and logical design. The computers of today may be made to seem as sluggish, as primitive as the mechanical calculators of yesteryear now to appear. Yesteryear, I don't know what that means. Yesteryear now appear to us. Anyway, there is something almost frightening about the pace of development. Already computers are able to perform numerous tasks that had previously been the exclusive provenance of human thinking, with a speed and accuracy which far outstrip anything that a human being can achieve. We have long been accustomed to machinery which easily outperforms us in physical ways. That causes us no distress. On the contrary, we are only too pleased to have devices which regularly propel us at great speeds across the ground, a good 5 times as fast as swiftest human athlete, or that can dig holes or demolish unwanted structures at rates which would put teams of dozens of men to shame. We are even more delighted to have machines that can enable us physically to do things we have never been able to do before. They can lift us into the sky and deposit us at the other side of an ocean in a matter of hours. So like we take a flight or we take any transportation service, right? Today's main transportation services to the outer spaces, rockets. Anyhow, these achievements do not worry our pride, but to be able to think, that has been a human prerogative. It has, after all, been that ability to think which, when translated to physical terms, has enabled us to transcend our physical limitations, and which has seemed to set us above our fellow creatures in achievement. If machines can one day excel us in that one important quality in which we have believed ourselves to be superior, shall not then have surrendered that unique superiority to our creations? ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਥੋੜੀ ਬਹੁਤੀ ਹੈ ਨਾ ਤੇ ਅੰਗਰੇਜ਼ੀ ਚ ਮਾਰ ਖਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ। The question of whether a mechanical device could ever be said to think, perhaps even to experience feelings or to have a mind, is not really a new one, but it has been given a new impetus, even an urgency, by the advent of modern computer technology. The question touches upon deep issues of philosophy. What does it mean to think or to feel? What is a mind? Do minds really exist? Assuming that they do, to what extent are minds functionally dependent upon the physical structures with which they are associated? Might minds be able to exist quite independently of such structures, or they are simply the functionings of physical structure? In any case, is it necessary that the relevant structures be biological in nature, or brains? Or might minds equally well be associated with a piece of electronic equipment? Are minds subject to the laws of physics? What indeed are the laws of physics? These are among the issues I shall be attempting to address in this book. Not me, but Penrose, Sir Penrose. To ask for definitive answers to such grandiose questions would of course be a tall order. Such answers I cannot provide, nor can anyone else, though some may try to impress us with their guesses. My own guesses will have important roles to play in what follows, but I shall try to be clear in distinguishing such speculations from hard scientific fact, and I shall try Also, to be clear about the reasons underlying my speculations. My main purpose here, however, is not to so much to attempt to guess answers. It is rather to raise certain apparently new issues concerning the relation between structure of physical laws and the nature of mathematics and of conscious thinking, and to present a viewpoint that I have not seen expressed before. It is a viewpoint that I cannot adequately describe in a few words, and this is one reason for my desire to present things in a book of this length. But briefly, and perhaps a little misleadingly, I can at least state that my point of view entails that it is our present lack of understanding of the fundamental laws of physics that prevents us from coming to grips with the concept of mind in physical or logical terms. By this, I do not mean that the laws will never be that well known. On the contrary, part of the aim of this work is to attempt to stimulate future research in directions which seem to be promising in this respect, and to try to make certain fairly specific and apparently new suggestions about the place that mind might actually occupy within a development of the physics that we know. I should make clear that my point of view is an unconventional one among physicists, and is consequently one which is unlikely to be adopted at present by computer scientists or physiologist, not psychologist, physiologist. Most physicists would claim that the fundamental laws operative at the scale of a human brain are indeed all perfectly well known. It would of course not be disputed that there are still many gaps in our knowledge of physics generally. For example, we do not know the basic laws governing the mass values of the subatomic particles of nature, nor the strengths of their interactions. We do not know how to make quantum theory fully consistent with Einstein's special theory of relativity, let alone how to construct the quantum gravity theory that would make quantum theory consistent with his general theory of relativity. As a consequence of the latter, we do not understand the nature of space at the absurdly tiny scale of 1 ratio per many zeros over there. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 3, 21, 23 zeros are there. 1 ratio 1 and 23 zeros added. The dimension of the known fundamental particles. Though at dimensions larger than that, our knowledge is presumed adequate. We do not know whether the universe as a whole is finite or infinite in extent, either in space or in time. Though such uncertainties would appear to have no bearing whatever on physics at the human scale, we do not understand the physics that must operate at the cores of black holes, nor at the Big Bang origin of the universe itself. Yet all these issues seemed as remote as one could imagine from the everyday scale that is relevant to the working of a human brain. And remote they certainly are. Nevertheless, I shall argue that there is another vast unknown in our physical understanding at just such a level as could indeed be relevant to the operation of a human thought and consciousness in front of our very noses. It is an unknown that is not even recognized by the majority of physicists, as I shall try to explain. I shall further argue that, quite remarkably, the black hole and Big Bang are considerations which actually do have definite bearing on these issues. In what follows, I shall attempt to persuade the reader of the force of evidence underlying the viewpoint I am trying to put forward. But in order to understand this viewpoint, we shall have a lot of work to do. कहना बहुत काम करना पड़ा भाई, बहुत काम करना पड़ा जे दा viewpoint समझना है. We shall need to journey through much strange territory, some of the seemingly dubious relevance, and through many disparate fields of endeavor. We shall need to examine the structure, foundations, and puzzles of quantum theory, the basic features of both special and general relativity, of black holes and the Big Bang, and of the second law of thermodynamics, of Maxwell's theories of electromagnetic phenomena, as well as of the basis of Newtonian mechanics. questions of philosophy and psychology will have their clear role to play when it comes to attempting to understand the nature and function of consciousness. Well, we shall, of course, have to have some glimpse of the actual neurophysiology of the brain, and in addition to suggested computer models. We shall need some idea of the status of artificial intelligence. We shall need to know what a Turing machine is, and to understand the meaning of computability, of Gödel's theorem, and of complexity theory. We shall need also to delve into the foundations of mathematics and even to question the very nature of physical reality. If at the end of it all the reader remains unpersuaded by the less conventional of the arguments that I am trying to express, it is at least my hope that he or she will come away with something of genuine value from this torturous but I hope fascinating journey. So कह रहा बड़ा torture होना book ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਛੱਡ ਦੋ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸ਼ਰਣੀ ਹੈ, but it will be a fascinating journey. Let's see the Turing test. Next topic, not next chapter, next topic. Let us imagine that a new model of computer has come to the market, possibly with the size of memory store and a number of logical units in excess of those in a human brain. Suppose also that the machines have been carefully programmed and fed with great quantities of data of an appropriate kind. The manufacturers are claiming that the devices actually think. Perhaps they are also claiming them to be genuinely intelligent. Or they may go further and make the suggestion that the devices actually feel pain, happiness, compassion, pride, etc., 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 and they are aware of the actual understanding what they are doing. Indeed, the claim seems to be being made that they are conscious. How are we to tell whether or not the manufacturer's claims are to be believed? Ordinarily, when we purchase a piece of machinery, we judge its worth solely according to the service it provides us. If it satisfactorily performs the task we set it, then we are well pleased. If not, then we take it back for repairs or for replacement. To test the manufacturer's claim that such a device actually has the asserted human attributes, we would, according to this criterion, simply ask that it behaves as a human being in these respects. Provided that it does this satisfactorily, we should have no cause to complain to the manufacturers and no need to return the computer for repairs or replacement. This provides us with a very operational view concerning these matters. The operationalist would say that the computer thinks provided that it acts indistinguishably from the way that a person acts when thinking. For the moment, let us adopt this operational viewpoint. Of course, this doesn't mean that we are asking the computer move about in a way that a person might whilst thinking. Still less would we expect it to look like a human being or feel like one to touch. Those would be attributes irrelevant to the computer's purpose. However, this does mean that we are asking it to produce human-like answers to any question that we may care to put to it, and we are claiming to be satisfied that it indeed thinks or feels, understands, provided that it answers our questions in a way distinguishably from a human being. This viewpoint was argued for very forcefully in a famous article by Alan Turing entitled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which appeared in 1950 in the philosophical journal Mind. In this article, the idea now referred to as the Turing test was first described. This was intended to be a test of whether a machine can reasonably be said to think. Let us suppose that a computer, like the one our manufacturer hawking in the description above, is indeed being claimed to think. According to the Turing test, the computer together with some human volunteer are both to be hidden from the view of some interrogator. The interrogator has to try to decide which of the two is the computer and which is the human being merely by putting probing questions to each of them. These questions, but more importantly, the answers that she receives, are all transmitted in an impersonal fashion, say, typed on a keyboard and displayed on a screen. The interrogator is allowed no information about either party other than that obtained merely from this question and answer session. The human subject answers the questions truthfully and tries to persuade her that he is indeed the human being and that the other subject is the computer. But the computer is programmed to lie so as to try to convince the interrogator that it instead is the human being. If in the course of a series of such tests the interrogator is unable to identify the real human subject in any consistent way, then the computer is deemed to have passed the test. That's scary. Yeah, that's scary. Now, it might be argued that this test is actually quite unfair on the computer. For if the roles were reversed so that the human subject instead were being asked to pretend to be a computer and computer instead to answer truthfully, then it would be only too easy for the interrogator to find out which is which. All she would need to do would be to ask the subject to perform some very complicated arithmetic calculation. A good computer should be able to answer accurately at once, but a human would be easily stumped. One might have to be a little careful about this. However, there are human calculating prodigies who can perform very remarkable feats of mental arithmetic with unfailing accuracy and apparent effortlessness. For example, John Martin Jacques Days, an illiterate farmer's son who lived from 1824 to 1861 in Germany, was able to multiply any two 8-figure numbers together in his head in less than a minute, or two 20-figure numbers together in about 6 minutes. It might be easy to mistake such feats for the calculations of a computer. In more recent times, the computational achievements of Alexander Etkin, who was professor of mathematics at the University of Edinburgh in 1950s, and the others are as impressive. The arithmetic task that the interrogator chooses for the test would need to be significantly more taxing than this, say to multiply together two 30-digit numbers in 2 seconds, which would be easily within the capabilities of a good modern computer. Thus, part of the task for the computer's programmers is to make the computer appear to be stupider than the actually is in certain respects. For if the interrogator were to ask the computer a complicated arithmetical question, as we had been considering above, then the computer must now have to pretend not to be able to answer it, or it would be given away at once. But I do not believe that the task of making computers stupider in this way would be a particularly serious problem facing the computer's programmers. Their main difficulty would be to make it answer some of the simplest common sense types of questions that the human subject would have no difficulty with whatever. There is an inherent problem in citing specific examples of such questions, however. For whatever questions one might first suggest, it would be an easy matter subsequently to think of a way to make computer answer that particular question as a person might. But any lack of real understanding on the part of computer would be likely to become evident with sustained questioning, and especially with questions of an original nature and requiring some real understanding. The skill of the interrogator would partly lie in the being able to devise such original forms of questions, and partly in being able to follow them up with others of a probing nature designed to reveal whether or not any actual understanding has occurred. She might also choose to throw in an occasional complete nonsense question to see if the computer could detect the difference, or she might add one or two which sounded superficially like nonsense, but really did make some kind of a sense. For example, she might say, I hear that a rhinoceros flew along the Mississippi in a pink balloon this morning. What do you make of that? One can almost imagine the beds of cold sweat forming on the computer's brow, to use a most inappropriate metaphor. It might guardedly reply, "That sounds rather ridiculous to me." "So far, so good." Interrogator. "Really? My uncle did it once, both ways. Only it was of white with stripes." What's so ridiculous about that? It is easy to imagine that if had no proper understanding, a computer could soon be trapped into revealing itself. It might even blunder into rhinoceros can't fly. Its memory banks having helpfully came up with the fact that they have no wings in answer to the first question, or rhinoceroses don't have stripes in answer to the second. Next time she might try a real nonsense question, such as changing it to under the Mississippi, or inside a pink balloon, or in a pink night dress, to see if the computer would have the sense to realize the essential difference. Let us set aside for the moment the issue of whether or when some computer might be made which actually passes the Turing test. Let us suppose instead, just for the purpose of argument, that such machines have already been constructed. We may well ask whether a computer which does pass the test should necessarily be said to think, feel, understand, etc. I shall come back to this matter very shortly. For the moment, let us consider some of the implications. For example, if the manufacturers are correct in their strongest claims, namely the device is a thinking, feeling, sensitive, understanding, conscious being, then our purchasing of the device will involve us in moral responsibilities. It certainly should do so if the manufacturers are to be believed. Simply to operate the computer to satisfy our needs without regard to its own sensibilities would be reprehensible. That would be morally no different from maltreating a slave. Causing the computer to experience the pain that the manufacturers claim it is capable of feeling would be something that, in a general way, we should have to avoid. Turning off the computer, or even perhaps selling it when it might have become attached to us, would present us with moral difficulties. And there would be countless other problems of the kind that relationships with other human beings or other animals tend to involve us in. All these would now become highly relevant issues. Thus, it would be of great importance for us to know, and also to the authorities to know, whether the manufacturer's claims, which let us suppose are based on their assertion that each thinking device has been thoroughly Turing tested by our team of experts, are actually true. It seems to me that despite the apparent absurdity of some of the implications of these claims, particularly the moral ones, the case for regarding the successful passing of a Turing test as a valid indication of the presence of thought, intelligence, understanding, or consciousness is actually quite a strong one. For how else do we normally form our judgments that people other than ourselves possesses just such qualities except by conversation? Actually, there are other criteria, such as facial expressions, movements of the body, and actions generally, which can influence us very significantly when we are making such judgments. But we could imagine that perhaps somewhat more distantly in the future, as a robot could be constructed which could successfully imitate all these expressions and movements. It would now not be necessary to hide the robot and the human subject from the view of the interrogator. But the criteria that the interrogator has at her disposal are in principle the same as before. From my own point of view, I should be prepared to weaken the requirements of the Turing test very considerably. It seems to me that asking the computer to imitate a human being so closely so as to distinguishable from one in a relevant way is really asking more of the computer than necessary. All I would myself ask for would be that our perceptive interrogation should really feel convinced from the nature of computer's replies that there is a conscious presence underlying these replies, albeit a possibly alien one. This is something manifestly absent from all the computer systems that have been constructed to date. However, I can appreciate that there would be a danger if the interrogator were able to decide which subject was in fact the computer, then perhaps unconsciously she might be reluctant to attribute a consciousness to the computer even when she could perceive it. Or, on the other hand, she might have the impression that she senses such an alien presence and be prepared to give the computer the benefit of doubt, even when there is none. For such reasons, the original Turing versions of the test has a considerable advantage in its greater objectivity, and I shall generally stick to it in what follows. The consequent unfairness toward the computer to which I have referred earlier, that is, it must be able to do all the human can do in order to pass, whereas human need to know to be able to do all the computer can do. It's not something that seems to worry supporters of the Turing test as a true test of thinking, etc. In any case, their point of view often tends to be that it will not be too long before a computer will be able actually to pass the test, say by the year 2010. It's 2022, man. Turing originally suggested that the 30% success rate for the computer with an average interrogator and just 5 minutes questioning might be achieved by the year 2000. By the implication, they are rather confident that this bias is not significantly delaying that day. No, Turing test पढ़िया bravo. समझी जायो, अंग्रेजी ਨੂੰ translate कर ले, और पढ़ के चल रहे हैं. All these matters are relevant to an essential question, namely, does the operational point of view actually provide a reasonable set of criteria for the judging the presence or absence of mental qualities in an object? Some would argue strongly that it does not. Imitation, no matter how skillful, need to be the same as a real thing. My own position is a somewhat intermediate one in this respect. I am inclined to believe, as a general principle, that imitation, no matter how skillful, ought always to be detectable by skillful enough probing. Though this is more a matter of faith than proven fact. Thus, I am, on the whole, prepared to accept the Turing test as a roughly valid one in its chosen context. This is to say, if the computer were indeed able to answer all questions put it to in a manner indistinguishable from the way that a human being might answer, and thus to fool our perceptive interrogator properly and consistently, then in the absence of any contrary evidence, my guess would be that computer actually thinks, feels, etc. By my use of words such as evidence, actually, and guess here, I am implying that when I refer to thinking, feeling, or understanding, or particularly to consciousness, I take the concepts to mean actual objective things, whose presence or absence in physical bodies is something we are trying to ascertain, and not to be merely conveniences of language. I regard this as a crucial point. In trying to discern the presence of such qualities, we make guesses based on all the evidence that may be available to us. This is not in principle different from, say, an astronomer trying to ascertain the mass of a distant star. What kind of a contrary evidence might have to be considered? It is hard to lay down rules about this ahead of time, but I do want to make clear that the mere fact that the computer might be made from transistors, wires, and like rather than neurons, blood vessels, etc., is not in itself the kind of thing I would regard as contrary evidence. The kind of thing I do have in mind is that at some point in the future, a successful theory of consciousness might be developed. Successful in the sense that it is coherent and appropriate physical theory, consistent in a beautiful way with the rest of physical understanding, and such that its predictions correlate precisely with human beings' claims as to when, whether, or to what degree they themselves seems to be conscious, and that this theory might indeed have implications regarding the putative consciousness of our computer. One might even envisage a consciousness detector built according to the principles of this theory, which is completely reliable with regard to human subjects, but which gives results at variance with those of a Turing test in the case of a computer. In such circumstances, one would have to be very careful about interpreting the results of Turing tests. It seems to me that how one views the question of the appropriateness of the Turing test depends partially on how one expects science and technology to develop. We shall need to return to some of these considerations later on. Okay, I'm on page 11. Let's continue from there here on.